the grief recovery method is a set of action steps that you can take to recover from grief. So what's involved is the first step is lots of education around the myths that we've been given about grief, right? So the things like, replace the loss, right? If you've lost a pet when you were young, oftentimes parents will say, we'll get you a new dog. Don't feel bad, right? The stages of grief is another big myth. Those were developed for people who received a diagnosis and not necessarily apply to when you lose somebody. There are no distinct stages in grief that people go through. Every grieving experience is unique. So the first part is a lot of just unlearning what we've been taught that's kept us stuck. And that's really pathologized grief.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Stacey Uhrig, and today's guest is Alison Marshal. So Alison is a grief recovery method specialist with the Grief Recovery Institute. So this is going to be fantastic. She's been a therapist for over 25 years, and she also specializes in spiritual hypnosis and motivational interviewing, which if you know me, you know is right up my alley because I'm also certified in hypnosis. But let me tell you a little bit about her backstory and how she got into where she is. Alison lost her dad by way of suicide at the age of 22, and she really started healing that relationship 25 years later with this grief recovery method that we're going to cover today. She's a therapist, she's a mom, and she's committed to personal development and healing. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, it's so nice to have you. So, I don't want to spend too much time on the past because I really want to get to this grief recovery method. But can you just share with us a little bit about this really challenging experience that you had when you were 22?
Yeah, Stacey, I'd love to. So, I would even go back farther to say that my experience with grief in regards to my father started very young. My parents separated when I was 1 year old. He was very much in and out of my life, more so out of my life. He struggled with many, many mental health symptoms. I remember waiting at the door for him only to have him not show up. And then the anxiety started about what was wrong with me, all through the years. And then the anger came in, I don't really need him around. I got my mom, things are good. And then we had not seen each other for months. And I just got this feeling one day that he wasn't okay. So I called him up and I went and saw him. And he kind of hugged me very tightly, but he always had done that. But as I was leaving the house, he kind of came out onto the driveway and watched me leave. And I had this thought something's off, something's wrong. And then a week later, I got the call that he had killed himself. And what ensued was just massive grief, massive anxiety, being unable to go back to my job that I was at, medication, doctors, all of the things. And in that time, since I've been 22, in those first few years, nobody mentioned grief. Everybody just said, you're anxious. It was always anxiety. Regardless of this, death, this would have happened to you anyway. So it got skipped over. And so what happened was I went on with life. I took the medication. I did the things. I did therapy. But every time I'd have an event in my life, like when I had my son, that grief would get triggered again. And I started parenting from fear and from lack and all of those things. And so 25 years later, I found this method and I lifted so much pain from myself and I feel so much lighter about that relationship.
I can't wait to get into that method, but I do have a couple of questions for you because I love being able to jam out with somebody else that is in the mental health space as their, vocation. Whenever I talk to people about trauma, I always remind people of a couple of things. Number one, it's never the event. It's the interpretation that you make in that event and the way that you really experience it and embody that interpretation, mind, body, spirit. right? And you mentioned something earlier, which is, his inability to show up, which now is really his own limitation from his own shit, right?
Very much so.
We interpret as young children as there must be something wrong with me. I must not be enough. If I were enough, he would have stuck around, right?
Yep.
And so we then start, if we adopt and believe that core belief, say before we're 8 or 9 or 10, we start now to live our life through that lens, right? We see ourselves through that lens. We see other people through that lens. We experience the world through that lens. And the other thing I recommend, or I always, remind people, is that in that experience where trauma is not the event, it's the interpretation, that interpretation creates a wound, right? And the Greek word for trauma is wound. That's the origin of it. And so when you're talking about having triggers, like becoming your own mom, diving back into that grief, what I keep hearing is the scab of that wound just keeps getting ripped off, right?
100%.
Because if it's upsetting to hear, but I'm so glad that you said it, because we are a collective group of people that believe that if we're going to a particular person for a particular thing, we're going to be taught the right thing, right? And the authority knows best. But the fact that you went to therapy and you went through all of this process for this quote unquote anger and sadness and depression on the heels of a death of a parent, and nobody's talking about grief, I'm not surprised, right? But it's disappointing that I'm not surprised by that. And so it's important for people to hear and understand that you can only be your best advocate. And if the initial event, or whatever the event is not being looked at as part of the issue, you have the right to question that too.
Very much so. And, the pull towards that pill that was going to make me feel better was so, so strong, right? I didn't want to feel the way I did. Like, I had a lot of complex emotions that are very normal in grief. But one of those was just embarrassed about the fact that my dad had killed himself. I was young. I was anxious. I couldn't go to work. So, yeah, the easiness of here's the pill, take that pill, make this go away was so compelling. So I don't even know that I would have been able to advocate for myself in that moment, because I felt so young. And again, it is surprising, but not surprising that nobody mentioned grief. And then to, discover that a number of years later is wild.
Now that you're older, right? And you're away from that circumstance and that event, what do you think was causing the sensation in your system that was so overwhelming and so debilitating that we all label as anxiety, right? We give it that name, but ultimately it's a sensation. So what do you think was causing that sensation in your system that was so debilitating you couldn't even get to work?
Yeah, so I have lots of thoughts about that. So ultimately, I think it was grief, but I think it was grief starting very young. Whenever I would be sad about my dad with my mom when I was young, and this is not to blame her, she did the best that she could, but, my mom was not comfortable with me being sad, right? She would try to fix it and make it better. And so then I became not comfortable with my sadness and my expression of my emotions. And so, but they were still happening for me. They were still very much happening internally. So what happened over the years was that grief, that sadness turned into anxiety, because that was an emotion that, got me to do things in my life. My mom was more comfortable with anxiety because she had anxiety. And then post his death, that grief just came up. And if you've lost somebody in your life, you might know this. Like, I I remember making this sound, and it wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a cry, and it wasn't a moan, but it was all three. And I remember looking over at my mom and her just being so uncomfortable with that expression. And I remember distinctly shoving it back down again. And I think I just couldn't keep shoving it down. Right?
Yeah.
It kept coming out.
And it needed to.
Yeah.
Right. So fast forward, you now work for, I want to get the word right. It's the Grief Recovery Institute. What is the Grief Recovery Institute?
Yeah, great question. So the Grief Recovery Institute was developed by a man named John James over 40 years ago. He had lost a son, I want to say it was within 6 weeks of the birth, and he had gone to his community, he had gone to his church, he'd gone to medical professionals, and the messages he was getting was, don't feel bad. Don't feel sad. You're young. You can have another baby. God needed another angel, right? All of those things that people say with the intention to help somebody, but that really don't help, right? And so he developed this grief recovery method, which is action steps that he went through to heal his grief, to deliver undelivered communications. And so he developed this program, and it's grown and grown and grown. It's in several different countries, several different languages, and it's been around for over 40 years.
And is it within the States? Is it in several different states?
I think so, yeah. Again, I'm new to it. It's also in Canada as well.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So there's a grief recovery method.
Right.
What is that method?
Yeah. So the grief recovery method is a set of action steps that you can take to recover from grief. He very much sort of based the program, I would say, around an AA mentality, Alcoholics Anonymous, about recovery. So what's involved is the first step is lots of education around the myths that we've been given about grief, right? So the things like, replace the loss, right? If you've lost a pet when you were young, oftentimes parents will say, we'll get you a new dog. Don't feel bad, right? The stages of grief is another big myth. Those were developed for people who received a diagnosis and not necessarily apply to when you lose somebody. There are no distinct stages in grief that people go through. Every grieving experience is unique. So the first part is a lot of just unlearning what we've been taught that's kept us stuck. And that's really pathologized grief. And then the next portion of that is to go through your life and look at a loss history. So where are the moments where I experienced loss? And those can be losing, moving to a new house. Those can be losing a pet, losing a job, right? And then the next part is you choose a relationship to work on. And it can be with somebody who's still alive, because we grieve our relationships when people are still alive. And we look at, again, what are those moments that were impactful in our lives? What were the positive moments? What were the not so positive moments? And then we look at the 3 recovery components, which are forgiveness, significant emotional statements, and apologies. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. And then it ends with a very specific letter that you read and write, that you read out loud. That's very different than, oftentimes as therapists, we're telling people to write letters and write how you feel. This is a very structured way to write this letter and to say goodbye to the pain of that loss, not to say goodbye to the person, but to give you the opportunity to say the things you've wanted to say. Because the thing that happens in death is, we have this shock, the air kind of goes out of the room. And then very soon after that, we start to think about what we wish we had said, what we wish we hadn't said, right? What we wish was more or different or better, right? And so it's giving you an opportunity to deliver those communications in a group format or with a therapist like myself, one-on-one.
Wow, that's amazing. Can
Mhm.
you go over a little bit about what those three components are?
Mhm. Yeah. So the first one is forgiveness. And, the important thing to know about this method is that in order to become a specialist, you have to go through the method yourself.
Yeah,
So,
so I was wondering how
yeah.
you actually applied this to your own grief. So that's good that you
Yeah.
bring that up.
Yeah. And so forgiveness, I really struggled with because I was really angry with my dad, right?
Yeah.
That's what again kept me going. And, if I was going to be angry, then I wasn't going to be sad in my bed. So forgiveness is one of the key components, and forgiveness is for yourself, right? And I'm sure you talk about that with your clients a lot, but that, what are the things I needed to forgive my dad for? And one of those things was I needed to forgive him for having mental health issues because I really villainized him, right? I couldn't even remember what some of the positive experiences were until I did this method. So that forgiveness piece, and part of it is you writing out what you forgive that person for. And then there were apologies that I also needed to make, right? Um, you know, I don't think anyone can predict a death like that, but I wished I had gone and visited him more. I wished I had asked him how he was feeling. And again, there's all kinds of intellectual reasons and reasons why I didn't do that. I was young, all the things, but I needed to say that to somebody out loud. And then there's the significant emotional statements where going through this method, I remembered some of the beautiful times that I had with him, and telling him that I really appreciated those times.
So one of the questions that I have for you is, it's actually two questions. First is fill in the blank. Grief is what?
A normal and natural response to a loss of any kind.
Right.
Normal and natural.
Right. And so, as you were talking about these three components, I actually was thinking a lot about some of my clients that come to me in a grief process, but it's not from the loss or the death of a person, but it's the loss or the death of a relationship, right? Or a loss of, or a death of their body as they knew it. Maybe they've had a major life altering surgery, or they have a diagnosis that's life altering. So, what I love about those components is I could see that process being so powerful, impactful for, say, some of my clients that are coming out of, you know, a broken relationship.
Yeah, relationships are a huge one. The Grief Recovery Institute has also written a book on relationship loss. Because again, the thing that typically happens is people either have things they want to say and can't say if they've been cut off from that relationship, or they're going over and over and over the things that went wrong.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's what I was thinking. It's
Yeah.
so easy and actually pretty comfortable to focus on all the reasons why it didn't work and what an asshole so and so was, and hold on to that anger, right?
Yep.
Versus, I think people misinterpret forgiveness. They think that if they forgive somebody, that maybe has really caused quite a bit of pain for the receiver, maybe the person I might be working with. They think it's almost like saying it was okay that the other person behaved that way.
Yeah.
So can you
Condonement.
talk? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what true forgiveness is? Because I think this is really important.
Yeah. So true forgiveness, again, is for you. And I'm glad you brought that up because I have worked with some people who've had, very significant traumas, and they've been physically, emotionally, or sexually harmed by the person we're talking about, right?
Right.
And so, again, it's not condoning any of that behavior, but it's how can I acknowledge these experiences? How can I give myself forgiveness? And how can I truly come to a place where I'm ready to let go of that anger? And,
Mhm.
my goal for people is to reach the sadness because, I myself really struggle to reach my sadness because I pushed it down, pushed it down, pushed it down. So it's forgiveness, I feel like, is just a bridge to feeling our true and real emotions. And the other piece is I have worked with people who just for many, many reasons were not able to get to that forgiveness. So what we would do is we would do an acknowledgement statement for that. And then with the hope that we can get to forgiveness. But again,
So would
forgiveness
an
is for us.
acknowledgement statement look like I understand that or I'm aware that?
Mhm. Yeah. So the I understand can sometimes be us trying to rationalize it away, right? And again, with my dad, I can fully understand his life and his how he, was with me. But understanding that is has kind of led a little bit to resentment. So I like your word of aware. I acknowledge that this was something you struggled with in your life,
Mhm.
and things like that. So just being careful not to rationalize it.
Well, it's funny because very often if I'm giving, say, a workshop and I'm trying to, round out the end of the workshop with like 4 things they can actually walk away with and do, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
One of the things I say is gaining radical awareness, right?
I
Of,
like that.
wow, right? This was such and such. But what
Yeah,
I tell them is the next, and it's a leap. This is not an easy next step, but the leap to the next step, and this is where so much of the work is done, is radical acceptance. This is a big difference
yes,
between being radically aware of something and accepting it. And I feel
very
like
much so.
once you accept, that's when surrender comes in. And in that surrender can be that forgiveness.
Mhm.
And, I'm very Buddhist by nature, right? I call myself like a foul mouth, Zen Buddhist. And, there's this concept of when you hold on to anger, it's like holding on to a hot stone. The only person that gets burned is you.
Yeah,
There's no
yeah.
good thing to hold on to that. It's like drinking poison. So, this idea of surrendering is being kind to yourself and
Mhm.
saying, I surrender all of this emotion, right? I forgive myself for holding on to all of this. I don't deserve to hold on to any of this anymore. I'm aware of why I was holding on to it. Is that part of the process?
Absolutely, 100%. And the other piece that I see with most people I work with is the big G word, the guilt.
Yeah.
Guilt, guilt, guilt. Survivor's guilt, I feel like, is the worst 2 words that were ever put together because there's an assumption that we should feel guilty. And then it's a self fulfilling prophecy. Um, so, like you said, self compassion is so important. But again, apologies, right? For me to be able to say out loud to a specialist and in a group format that, Dad, I apologize for not asking you how you were more gave me such relief. I can't even tell you, even though he wasn't there to hear it. And the beautiful thing about the method is on the other side is people simply acknowledge that. They don't try to fix it. You are instructed in fact, not to say a whole lot because it's just giving people that container of space to find the forgiveness and then to let go of the guilt.
So, one of the things that's in my head as you're talking is when it comes to the death of a person, right? Which is all encompassing because if somebody dies, the relationship comes to an end as well, right? It's a whole holistic experience. How do you work with people who are experiencing the death of a child?
Mm, that is a wonderful question. So I am new to the method, so I have not worked with somebody that has experienced the death of a child, but I know many specialists who have, and that here's the perspective of the institute is that grief is grief, And a lot of people will talk about complex grief or complicated grief, or, make assumptions that having lost a child would be more of a grief experience than another loss. But I have worked with clients in private practice where they have lost a child, and it actually wasn't that loss. It was the loss of the relationship that ensued after they lost that child.
Yeah.
So grief is grief. Grief is grief.
Yeah. And, I recently read, I don't have the quote in front of me, but I'll paraphrase it. This idea of being ready, willing, and able to actually deal with the grief. Because even if you're holding on to whatever the complex emotion is that's associated with the grief, sadness, anger, guilt, shame, sometimes people aren't willing to let go of it because connection left to that person.
Yeah, we connect through pain, and what I would say this method does is it helps you connect to love, without being too cheesy. That's what it does.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to bring this to a close.
Yeah.
Because, it is complicated and it is complex, and we could talk about it forever, right? Yep. But we're going to end it here for the sake of all. If somebody wants to learn more about you or this grief recovery method, what's their best next step?
Yeah, so I don't have a fancy website yet. You can find me on Instagram. It's Alison _Marshal _. And then what I'll do, Cece, is I'll leave you my email. That's the best way to get a hold of me. You can also find me on Psychology Today under Alison Marshal, or at the Grief Recovery Institute. You'll see a little bit of a microsite with me on there. And I work with people virtually and in person. So.
Okay. And we'll make sure that all of that information is in the show notes. And I also see here that you have several free ebooks to offer. So how can somebody get access to the ebook?
Yeah, so it's the Grief Recovery Institute.com, I think, but let me clarify that and send that to you as well. And I will send you the links to the ebooks.
Perfect. And we'll put that right into the show notes. So we'll make it really easy for everybody. But, I think grief as an experience can be very traumatic, right? For anybody involved. And if we remember, trauma is not the event, it's how we embody the experience, mind, body, and psyche. And it's either the opening of a wound or it's the pouring of sand into an existing wound that hasn't quite been healed yet. And what's so lovely about the idea that trauma is not the event, it's the interpretation, is you can't change the event. But you can change the way that you experience the event. And that's a good thing, right? And so it's nice to know that we have people like Alison on board that can support people through their grief process. Again, we'll have all of the links to Alison and the Grief Recovery Institute in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on today. I think this is going to be a very, very useful podcast episode for a lot of people.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you so much.